You're listening to Brand Newsroom, the weekly podcast for anyone who has a say in the way companies are communicating, including content marketing, brand journalism, PR, and earned media. Produced by Lush, the content agency, in association with Media Stable.
Hello, welcome to Brand Newsroom. I'm James Lush of Lush, the content agency. No Hazy today, but content strategist Sarah Mitchell is here. So, Sarah, are you a good listener?
I don't know. I would like to think that I'm a good listener, but my 14-year-old son tells me I'm not a good listener. So I guess it depends on the situation and the context. But I don't know that I'm the best person to tell you whether or not. You would probably know better than me if I'm a good listener.
It's funny. I've spent a large proportion of my life listening in radio interviews that I always think it's about the guest, not about the interviewer. And a lot of radio stations have interviewers who think it's all about them and not about the guest. But I spent most of my time listening because I just think that, you know, if by listening, you've got your cue for your next question, or you can go wherever the audience might be interested in you taking it. So I think I'm okay, but I'm always very conscious that I could do better. It's such an interesting topic today because we can speak between 125 and 175 words per minute, but our mind can process 3 to 4 times more words than that. So it's all too easy to just drift off, to get distracted. And I'm hoping as I'm saying this, you are still with me. But what price do we all pay in our home lives and in our businesses for not listening? And how do we become better listeners? Joining us today is an expert on the subject, the author of Deep Listening and Breakthroughs, head of the coaching faculty at the Marketing Academy Australia, Oscar Trimboli. Oscar, thank you for joining us. You've been listening carefully to our introduction, paying real attention, but I want to ask you first up, the negative of this. What do you think the costs are of not listening?
Look, for brands and leaders in organisations, the costs are extraordinary. Customers leave organisations when they feel like they're not being listened to. Employees leave bosses that aren't listening to them, and people leave their partners because they don't feel that they're listened to. And the number one reason for malpractice lawsuits is doctors don't listen. So no matter what domain we look at listening, is the cost of not listening is huge. Just ask the US Democratic Party the cost of not listening to their base in the last election and ignoring them. That was a fairly significant cost, not only for the Democratic Party, but possibly for the rest of the world.
Those are great examples, and let's face it, very costly ones. But anyone listening to this is going to say, of course I listen. You know, I've been doing it for X years. You know, I came out of, you know, mum's tum, and I've been listening ever since. And we all will say we listen, but there are many different levels of listening, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But how would you sum up how we do listen, generally speaking, today? And I say today because I would imagine that there are more distractions than ever when it comes to listening.
The problem with listening is we don't know what good looks like, because how good we think we are about listening is always in our head. 85% of people think they're above average car drivers, and 83% of people think they're above average listeners. And yet instinctively we know when somebody's not listening. So even having an awareness to know what good listening is like is half the battle. Now throw in a distraction to the brain with a mobile device, a computer, an iPad, something ringing in the background, the proliferation of all these additional things. The minute the visual cortex is engaged when you're looking at a notification on a phone or a sound from a phone, it's shutting down the auditory or the listening part of your brain. So those people who believe they can multitask are completely wrong. And the science says that you can't do it properly. You can micro switch, but you can't actually jump tasks. So more devices distracting us, designed by the gambling and gaming industry to play on the visual part of the brain, which is dominant, will make us worse listeners in this decade and in the 21st century. So we have to be supremely confident that the first level of listening has got nothing to do with the person speaking, but the first level of listening is actually listening to yourself and making sure you've got space in your mind so that you can listen to the other person. in most cases, people are jumping from a meeting to a meeting, or they're jumping from a phone call to a phone call. They've forgotten what they're supposed to be doing in the moment because they're busy processing what they've just heard, or figuring out what they need to do tonight to prepare a meal or pick up one of the children from school or a friend from the airport, and all of a sudden everybody listening to this is completely distracted.
Sarah, have you noticed, the wonders of conferences, for example, today, when we're all paying close attention to the person that's speaking, how many people are now on devices? And I would imagine that is a good example of what Oscar's just talking about, how we think we're listening, but we're really not listening at all.
Well, that's so interesting that you bring that up, James, because this proliferation of live tweeting at events, what I've noticed is that if I'm tweeting something that the speaker is saying, then I really capture that because I've actually written what they're saying or a quote in a tweet, but I probably missed the next 2 or 3 minutes. So, and as a speaker, I can see it happening in the crowd, and I can see from the questions that I get. I thought I did say that, I covered that, but you didn't hear it because you were heads down, typing away. So I think it's true.
It is also on the rise as well, isn't it, Oscar? You go to most public forums now, or in fact, you can even go into meetings with clients or potential new clients, and there is still one part of the brain that you see with the person you're talking to that is looking at some device.
And for most of us, we just need to role model that to the other person we're with. So one of the things I do deliberately and teach my clients to do, that's a lot of executives that are chief marketing officers or advertising agency leads, be deliberate, take out your phone at the beginning of the meeting and just say, hey guys, just bear with me while I switch off my phone and I'm just going to put it in my bag because this meeting is really important to me. And at first they kind of go, that's too simple, Oscar. But leaders role modeling this and being in the moment and knowing that the phone's not on. So that's not in vibrate mode, that's not on, because now people have devices connected to their watches, so they don't even have to go to the bag and get the phone. Switch the device off, but announce the fact you're doing it. You will completely change the state of the meeting, and at least for the first third of the meeting, you're going to have everybody's undivided attention.
Okay, so tell me why that's so important. What do you think it's signalling?
Particularly for the leader, they're saying, right now, and for the rest of the time we're together, I'm not going to be distracted by anything else other than what you say. So we're sending a very clear signal to the group. The most important thing on the leader's mind for the next half an hour or the next 25 minutes or the next 45 minutes is this conversation. Very few leaders that I work with, because when I'm in coaching mode with them, I will literally sit in the room and witness what they're doing in meetings, and the very first thing I'll say to them after the first meeting where I'm watching them in their leadership teams, okay, next meeting, you're going to announce that you're switching off your phone, because it gives permission for the rest of the room to say that behaviour is okay. If it's important enough to get 6, 10, 20 people in a room and the leader to be present, they need to be present.
It's good advice. I want to ask you as well about those different levels of listening. You talk about listening to yourself, but in your book, which is terrific, very simple to digest, you talk about the difference between listening to the content, listening to the context, listening to the unsaid, and listening to the meaning. What do you mean by some of those? Yeah,
and so what I did was I actually went back and listened to a couple of the Brand Newsroom episodes, and James, you're excellent at level 2. You do a great job with what kind of questions where you're asking about defining things as you are right now. So listening to the content is about asking questions about what's being processed in the conversation. So you're asking me about the levels of listening. The other piece of content you need to listen to is visual. You need to watch the person, not just listen to them. So keep your eyes focused on a triangle, an upside down triangle from the eyebrows across and down to the chin. The number one signal that you're listening to the other person is your eye contact, not so much your verbal confirmation. So content is listening to what's said, but also watching what's said, because the highest level of listening to content is listening for energy. Holly Ransom, who interviewed President Obama recently, somebody from Western Australia, an amazing emerging leader at 28 years old, said she listened with great intensity to the energy that President Obama brought to the conversation, because she knew that he was speaking with conviction. She interviews a lot of people, and she said the thing she listens for is this energy, and she can tell really quickly when people aren't really convicted about what they say. So that's the listening to the content, or level 2. Level 3, Sarah does this really well, and I think it's a function of her role as well as how she orientates herself. So she listens for patterns, she makes connections across domains, and she's very future orientated in the kinds of questions she asks. So Sarah asks a lot of context questions about how's this connected to the marketplace, how's this connected to a customer, how does this fit with a content strategy plan. So people who listen at the context level listen for the capital letters that people are talking with. They listen very carefully to the adjectives, and they notice the patterns really well. And then the deepest level of listening here is listening for the backstory. Where have we come from to create this context so we know where we're going? The last 2 levels, listening for what's unsaid, sounds like a bit of a Yoda ninja move. How can you listen to what's unsaid? But in a lot of conversations with executives and leadership teams and marketing leaders, the number one question you can always ask is, if the CFO was in the room right now, what question would they ask we haven't covered off? And the difference between a good marketer and a great marketer are the people who can answer those questions about the commercial outcomes of a campaign and a result of a content strategy, rather than just talking about clicks and likes. The other question you might ask is, if the competitors were in the room right now, what questions would they ask? If the competitor in the room right now, would they be laughing at us, or would they be worried? The last level, level 5, listening for meaning. My favourite story around this was a workshop with a tech company I did, and I asked everybody to describe the current organisation state as an animal, and everybody described a soaring eagle, an osprey, a bird of prey, or something really elegant. And we came around to Elaine. She was the quietest person in the room, and said, let's be honest, we're really snakes. Drop in the room.
Yeah.
And I said at that point, Elaine, I'm really curious. Tell me more. And she said, isn't it obvious to everybody? I said, it's not obvious to me. And she said, we're like a snake. Every season we shed our skin and we adapt to the environment in which we're in. I think it's a really good thing. But for most people, the minute she said snake, everybody thought negative thoughts, slimy, unexpected attack, not knowing where it is and being worried about it. And she was able to verbalize meaning through shedding of the skin and ability to adapt. Very few leaders listen at that level. Very few brands listen at that level. Brands that do ethnographic research, that really spend time with their customers and their competitors' customers and watch what they do in their daily lives, not just in product usage, but in other environments that are before and after that, are brands that really get meaning.
That's really interesting. Sarah, what springs out as we hear Oscar describe that?
Just how self-conscious I am all of a sudden that somebody has analyzed me and things that I've said in the past. But to me, it's absolutely fascinating that what we take away from our day is based on not only what we've listened to, but how we've listened to it. And I hadn't really considered that before.
I totally agree. And it's interesting, Oscar. I have to ask you, what sort of response do you get when you alert people to this?
Look, people are delighted that there's even a framework they can have a conversation, a palette on which they can choose colours to listen through. Most people kind of know what listening is. They just don't know how to do it, and they don't know how to progress to be better. For most of us, we're distracted. And it's really interesting because I always talk about the 4 villains of listening. I talk about the lost listener, the dramatic listener. I talk about the interrupting listener and the shrewd listener. And everybody can identify in themselves what they struggle with when it comes to listening. So whether it's an audience in a speaking environment, an audience in a training environment, or audience feedback on the interviews I do with expert professional and personal listeners, they all come back and go, wow, I didn't even know you could have a framework to listen through. And it just gives them a couple of really simple steps to do. And the most simple step that I consistently say to everybody, there was a piece of research done in 1993 in Quebec in Canada. The deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. So just breathing a little bit more deeply, you get oxygen to your brain. Listening cognitively is a really tough thing to do, and particularly tough to stay focused. So when you're struggling listening to somebody, you just want to breathe a little bit more deeply, and all of a sudden you'll be present in the conversation.
I like that. It's true, and it sort of, I suppose, it's flavour of the month at the moment, with more people wanting to find that mindfulness or meditation. So much is connected with the breathing. I just want to end, if I can, Oscar, with the 4 types of listening that you talk about in the book. And very briefly, can you just describe for us what you mean by intentional, systemic, curious, and progressive?
Yeah. So the intentional listener comes to a dialogue with the intention to be very clear about what they're listening for, not just for themselves, not just for the other person, but for the whole conversation. So one of the things that really good listeners do, they don't just listen to the conversation, they're intentional about progressing the dialogue. So the dialogue is a game of passing a ball between two people. The progressive listener wants to make sure that we are making progress. The progressive listener will always be asking questions about what's next. So Nick's a great example of a progressive listener. He's really pragmatic. He wants the outcome, and Nick's always asking, why does it matter? Where's show me the money kind of approach in there. The curious listener is listening really carefully for the questions and statements that the speaker hasn't considered, not the questions that they have considered, because it's great being a genius, but it's not helping the speaker or the dialogue. So from that point of view, the curious person is always going, oh, my favourite curious question is, what else have you thought about on this topic? Or, how long have you been thinking about this topic? It's actually got nothing to do with the topic, but it just gets the person reflecting on how they're thinking about the topic. Then the final listener is the systemic listener who's thinking about it across multiple domains. Sarah's a great example of this. She thinks about it from a customer's perspective, a competitor's perspective, the employee's perspective, how that relates to regulators and governments across the domains in which their clients are operating. So the systemic listener has a longer term view in the kinds of questions and listening they do compared to maybe a progressive listener, where Nick's all about today and tomorrow. Sarah's all about the next week, the next month, the next year. So that's a quick look at the 4 different types of listening heroes.
I hope when you analyse this one, Oscar, you'll notice that we've done a lot more listening than talking. But I was always, funny enough, I was always taught when I first went into broadcasting, remember 2 ears, 1 mouth. It's a pretty good rule.
Mm. And there's been a really interesting piece of research published only in July this year that analysed 25,000 outbound sales calls in the US. And they've put it through a huge data engine, and the highest performing sales reps have a 46% speak, 54% listen ratio. So they listen more than they speak, but it's not actually in the 3-to-1 ratio of 2 ears and 1 mouth. So the highest performing reps are listening more than they're speaking, that's for sure. And I'll be happy to send you the link to that research for your show notes.
That's really good. Really interesting. It's always good to have that statistical evidence. But just final word. I'm curious to know how quickly we can change our habits if we, in listening to this, recognise that we're not listening as effectively as we could be. How easy is it to make those changes, to see the change take place in the outcome, Oscar? Yeah,
it's so simple. You could be literally doing it now if you just breathed a little bit deeper while you were listening to this podcast. But sustaining that is a 21 to 90 day kind of habit. And whichever piece of research you believe, somewhere in between the 21 to 90 days is the range in which you can do that. And whether it's listening to the podcast or getting the book or signing up for a 90-day challenge. All those things are possible, but I would suggest the simplest thing you could do is either speak to a boss or a co-worker at work and say, hey, when I listen really well, will you say, well done? And when I'm not, can you just let me know? Because it's hard for me to notice when I'm not listening.
That's good. Very good. All right. That's Sarah's just sitting here. Don't you worry. She's still here. She's just paying close attention to every word you're saying.
No, I'm nodding my head because last week I interviewed Justin Kirby and it was just me. So I didn't have the luxury of relying on James to do all the listening. And I found that whole thing that you talked about where I had no visual cues whatsoever, I was almost disturbed at how difficult it is to do your job, James. So this is just such a fascinating topic, Oscar. I feel like I could talk to you all day about it. But thank you so much for some of those just basic tips that anybody can apply like right now.
So agree. If we can, we'll end with our On My Desk segment. It's the segment where we each recommend something that we've come across during the past week that we think you'll like. So as our special guest, Oscar, you can have your first recommendation for us.
I would love to talk about the 25-minute meeting by Donna McGeorge, published by Wiley. Half the time and double the impact. I love her 3P model of punctual, present and prepared. And I know she's worked with organisations all around the world, including Ford and many others, to implement the 25-minute meeting. And I can hear a sigh of relief from a lot of people listening right now. I'd love to grab a copy of this book.
That's a really great idea. 25 minutes, the shorter the better. And I think the idea of putting some structure around it is excellent. Because it's amazing how much we do pad them out, isn't it?
I spend time watching meetings professionally, and most meetings can be done at least in a third of the time allocated, because most times agendas aren't clear. People are present at the meeting who don't need to be there or don't know why they need to be there, and rarely are the outcomes and accountabilities documented and followed up on.
Good recommendation. Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, well, I had to have a topic today or a recommendation that you have to listen to. I've been listening to the Echo Junction podcast with Adam Frazier. Really good. He gets such fascinating guests on from all different roles in the marketing background, from academics straight through to practitioners. So if you get a chance, have a listen to that. It's really helped me in a number of ways just understand better, I guess, the whole marketing ecosystem.
I have also gone for a podcast because to me, the example I'm going to give today is about the common sense part. And so much of what you've talked about, Oscar, funnily enough, is common sense. And it's when we suddenly go, oh, come on, this is ridiculous. It's a podcast called Unfiltered. It's with James O'Brien. Back in England, James is a broadcaster, but he's got this fantastic podcast where he talks to some amazing people. And the one I listened to the other day, which was just brilliant, you'll know Jamie Oliver, of course. He's known all around the world, but it's about a 40-50 minute interview with Jamie Oliver in great depth. And one of the reasons why I like this, and I'm recommending it today, is because it talks about common sense and how, as a human being, there is so much which is just not common sense. And he, although he's not an expert in X, Y, or Z, he just feels that it's his job to try and bring some common sense to some of the major issues in the world. And luckily he's able to with his brand and his reputation. But it's a great listen in terms of how someone's brave enough and bold enough to actually go forward and do something positive. So that's my recommendation. Go and have a listen to that. Okay, we've done our listening. We've broken it down into all sorts of constructive takeouts. Oscar, we thank you so much. The book you've put together is beautifully put together in a lovely, neat box, isn't it? Nice. Yeah, it's very tactile.
I love the whole package, the branding, everything.
Me too. It's called Deep Listening: Impact Beyond Words. Oscar, we thank you. If people want to find you on Twitter, what's your handle?
Oscar Trimboli.
Easy, and there wouldn't be many Oscar Trimbolis, I wouldn't have thought.
There's only one.
There's only one. Good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
That's it for another week. If you've enjoyed today's show, please tell a couple of friends about it. It's a good episode to send to people passively, aggressively, I would say. Show notes available, brandnewsroom.net, production by Dan Hatch and Reese Wayward. We will be back next week, and thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the weekly podcast Brand Newsroom. You can subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play Music, or Stitcher. Simply search for Brand Newsroom. For more information on anything you've heard on the show, go to brandnewsroom.net.